Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to here from the BART Graduate Center. I welcome you to the second Archaeological Encounters lecture of the current academic session. You might remember last semester we heard Rachel Kiddy on migrant materialities. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge our presence on Lenapehoking, the ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape, and recognize New York City as a past and future home of indigenous people, as well as others subjected to forced migrations, diasporas, and resettlement. We hope that the discussion we host can highlight the role which the study of material culture can play in calling attention to voices and experiences that might otherwise go unheard. I'm going to keep my introduction very short, as our speaker, Stephanie Bunn, will offer the best intro one could possibly think of in the form of a crosscut of recurring questions and themes in her anthropological work on what is sometimes known as soft technologies of making, enacted through the sensory interplay of hands, bodies, minds, and the environment, with a focus on weaving textiles and baskets in diverse social and ecological contexts. Stephanie Bunn is a senior lecturer in social anthropology at the University of St. Andrews. Her academic career involved an apprenticeship in felt making among the pastoral nomads in Kyrgyzstan, which was conducted as field work towards her PhD at Manchester University, supervised by Tim Ingold. And then she moved on to working with basket makers in Scotland, of which we'll hear more today. And her PhD was the foundation for her 2011 nomadic felts published by the British Museum. So this is the book I'm best familiar with in my own work on Central Asian archaeology. This provided a really stimulating, wonderful springboard towards exploring my non-contemporary material through contemporary forms of meaning making embedded in craft, creativity, connective landscapes, and human-animal relationships. And more recently, she co-edited a volume that's out very recent, Bloomsbury 2020, with Victoria Mitchell on the material culture of basketry. And she authored numerous articles on topics ranging from pedagogy, well-being, oral history of Kyrgyz makers, nomadic tents, grown artifacts, and making and mobility. She also led a great number of collaborative research projects, such as Knowing from the Inside, Anthropology, Art, Architecture, and Design, which was a European Research Council project. Then Sound and Anthropology, the Body, the Environment, and Human Sound Making. That was a British Academy project. And of course, the two she'll be focusing on today, her latest ones, Woven Communities and Forces in Translation. But before I hand over to Stephanie, a word on how today's event will run. So Stephanie will speak for 30 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, and then we will open up things for questions and discussions. For the question and answer session, please use the Q&A function. We have colleagues and students joining us as panelists. And for the panelists, please use the raise hand function, and I will call on you to unmute and ask your question. We also have automatic captioning, which you can turn on with your at the bottom of your screen, the CC button, and I'm going to now turn over. I probably had a problem with my page there. I'm going to now turn over things to the speaker, Stephanie Bunn. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. Very much appreciate it. So I'm actually going to start with a brief context and something perhaps not expected, which is, oh dear, now I have to figure out how to get this to go forward. Okay, a brief history of my work. So, although I did an honours degree in anthropology when I was 18, I then followed this by working as an artist and a maker for the next 20 years, before I went back to studying a PhD in anthropology at around the age of 38. So this is a slide of the sort of artwork I did at that time, and I hope it perhaps gives some insight as to the way I've conducted research ever since. So being quite large scale, whether art or anthropology, my work has been ever since hands-on, collaborative and community oriented. And I think this background has also given me the confidence, if you like, to work through practice, even in an academic department, and to do public engagement work with people that I otherwise would not have felt able to do. Now, my PhD research, just to give you a bit more background, was focused, developed out of this work, and it was focused on Central Asian textiles, as Casper said. And I did field work through apprenticeship to 3 felt makers in high mountain Kyrgyzstan. And my focus there was on learning the skills and the knowledge that came along with or through learning felt making. So you see here me being, a complete novice, learning some of the basics of just how to fluff up wool or card it, if you like, and being actually a source of great amusement to everybody else except for myself. And also, just so as everyone can see, the teacher who I like to acknowledge as the main teacher who taught me what I know about Kyrgyz felt. And out of this, as Casper said, came a collection of felts for the British Museum, an exhibition called Striking Tents, and the book Nomadic Felts. So during my research, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about this because I think there's quite a lot of differences between the work I now do on basketry and the work I did on felt. And one of them is that obviously felt is not woven in any way, shape or form. And it's kind of took me in a different way, but I think it's also, again, been very formative. So during my field work, I found myself learning about Kyrgyz patterns and how they related to Kyrgyz cosmological ideas and about human relations with the environment, which in fact are very closely related. And this was something that local people who had heard that I was interested in felt making took me towards, and it anticipated that I would be interested in, although I hadn't necessarily ever said so. As an anthropologist, because anthropologists try to be responsive rather than beginning with theories, we like to see where people take us. I responded to this encouragement from my field companions. And one thing that I learned quickly was that you could not really separate the Kyrgyz aesthetic from their patterns, and that often the aesthetic was just as meaningful as the motif. And that also you couldn't just look at patterns as a kind of lexicon from which you can translate. In a sense, most patterns in the art of the people I've worked with aren't narrative or some kind of code. They're much more about what is meaningful to the people concerned, are interested in their daily lives. And that interest really synthesizes motif and aesthetic rather than turning it into a symbol. And just as one illustration before I move on to the work in basketry, a core ethic of Kyrgyz herders who lived in the mountains that I work with was one of balance. And that means it's what you take from the environment, you have to reciprocate back to it in some way. So if you hunt, then you must in some way negotiate with the powers in nature so that the substance you've taken from the world in, say, hunting, such as a deer or a badger that you've hunted, can be rebalanced and respected. And the point I want to make here is that this ethic of balance is reflected in Kyrgyz designs and in their patterns in the way that these themselves are balanced into a kind of positive and negative form. So just very briefly, this pattern, the red horn pattern, is reciprocated even in the design So you see the inside and outside of patterns are designed and drawn in this way. And I found this incredibly important because it really resonated with me with how people worked with the environment in general. And I think it's very difficult to talk about any form, any creative form which draws materials from the environment, which doesn't also reflect the relationship that people have with their environment. Now, I could spend my whole lecture discussing this, but I'm going to move on now to consider the role of embodied learning in material culture and the more recent work in basketry and learning skills. So having come to work in St Andrews, I found myself in the company of a group of basket makers, the Scottish Basket Makers Circle. And their initial interest when I began working with them in 2012 was to document the last remaining Scottish basket makers and the history of local baskets before the old makers who had learnt their skills as part of their way of lives passed on and their baskets were no longer made. And so to do this, we set up a project called Woven Communities. This wasn't a particularly popular subject among my colleagues. It had a sort of sense of salvage ethnography to them, I guess, and it wasn't what they felt an anthropologist would be doing. Neither felt nor basketry had a lot of status in UK anthropology, certainly in my department, but I think probably quite generally at the time. It was perhaps a little bit too homely or a bit touchy-feely. But nevertheless, there was one colleague who really supported me, a man called Nigel Rapport, and he pointed out that there are two things that were interesting, aside from just documenting history of the baskets and so on. And firstly, these were the way that you could explore a great deal of social history through just one artifact, which acted as a kind of fabric of society. And the second point that he suggested was how the baskets themselves and the materials from which they're made seem to elicit a response and a commitment from contemporary practitioners, which was why they were so keen to document them and record them historically. So just looking at what I mean, first of all, by baskets as a fabric of society, across Scotland really, East, West, Highlands, and in the Western and Northern Islands, until very recently, you could say until the 1950s and the petrochemical revolution, when we got shopping trolleys and plastic bags, baskets were absolutely fundamental for carrying things with, doing work with, even in industry. So from the fishing communities, and these are all the fisher lassies at the top, they all carried their fish round in back baskets, to in the Highlands, the traveller community, to local fishermen in the East Coast who went out fishing and used these special baskets to distribute their fishing lines, and to crofters carrying home peat, and to Orcadians who also had to use different materials, and even used basketry materials for things like the backs of their chairs, because there was no wood hardly available on the Northern Isles. So, you know, these literally were a lens through which one could explore Scottish social history and historical practices. And in this, they had something in common with felt making in Central Asia, because in Central Asia, for them, the herders that I worked with, fabric at the time was also felt at the time was also a fabric of society par excellence. Now, one difference perhaps is that Scottish baskets did not have the same kind of aesthetic concerns that felt had in Central Asia, but they certainly were bound up with the way that people worked in their environment. Since baskets are made from plant materials and they require these materials for their construction, and that involves all sorts of understanding and knowledge of local ecology. And furthermore, many areas of Scotland don't grow conventional basketry materials such as willow or rush, which are very common in Western Europe. So people had to use quite unorthodox materials such as dock, heather, black oat straw, hair moss, or marram grass. And you can see 3 examples here. These 3 baskets, almost the same kind of basket, the same form, but looking really quite different because they've all required different kinds of materials, because that was what was available. I mean, even from one part of an island to another, sometimes one area would work with floss or rush, and another area in the Northern Isles would work with something like heather or with dock. So this is really the way that we initially used baskets in our study of baskets as a fabric of society. And we went right through even to looking at things like hot air balloon baskets and baskets used in war and baskets used in industry. Now, the second factor that I think made baskets so anthropologically interesting was why so many contemporary basket makers developed a real passion for the materials and local basketry history once they'd started to learn the skill. They wanted to know where the materials grew, how they'd been processed in the past, and how to make the old forms. And if it was possible, they wanted to learn from someone who'd learned their skills from a traditional lifestyle and traditional use. The basket makers I worked with all had this pattern, and this is a kind of one part of the project that they did while I was working with them, which was from plant to basket project, where we actually went out to an island off Lewis, cutting marram grass on Calisay, which you look across to the other image on the right, the black and white photograph, reflects the kind of ways that people, the practice that people had of gathering marram grass baskets a century earlier, where people had their own marram grass patches where they could gather it for making baskets. And so the fact that contemporary makers were interested in doing this made me think that it was as if the active engagement with materials and technique drew people to learn more, as if the artifacts and the process elicited a kind of curiosity in makers. And as an anthropologist working on a kind of ethno-social history of Scottish social history through its baskets, by meeting the Scottish Basket Makers Circle, I had alongside me a whole group of people who already had, through a kind of autodidactic method, had already learned so much about dimensions, techniques, histories, specificities of regional styles and forms, recent local makers and museum collections, all because their passion had inspired them to get to know more about the skill when they once had started it. This second interest for me kind of was the beginning of a new understanding or an expansion of my understanding of embodiment, if you like, and my interest in embodiment. As practitioners, people learn textile skills through subtle and manipulative actions of their hands, whether sewing or weaving or doing embroidery or basketry. So to study textiles academically can only be enriched by hands-on practice of these skills. And the question is then, what are people learning alongside the skills in themselves? And what's the content of the skills that they're learning? People who don't make things often assume that making involves a kind of imposition of a form or an idea onto a material, that you just decide you're going to make a certain form and you then enact this. But you only have to think about this a little while to realize that there's so much more to making something. If only it was that easy to make what you had in mind. In fact, learning a skill like basketry or knitting or weaving involves a real subtle dexterity of the fingers and the hands and the body. So I'll just play you a short clip of John Cowan making a half cran, which is a basket he's seen in a museum, and he's trying to learn how to make, because there's nobody left with any skills. So he's bringing his skills of making other baskets like quarter crowns to play here, but he's actually going to show us how he worked with this basket he'd never made before.
I think it's really good to make so many of these, because I've never made this before. I'm not sure how to space them, get the idea of the distance in the eye. Because I've made the water cans, sometimes I know what the spaces should be roughly right. So I'm hoping that I get the finish here, a big white gap there.
Yeah.
You've just got to then. It's the only way to learn, isn't it? It's just try and do it.
So I don't know if you can see here that as John is making this, his kind of movement and his practice is almost like a kind of dance, but at the same time, there's a kind of stillness and focus, almost always a very special focus of attention between the maker, the material, and the space in between. And also, I think you'll have seen that the material is not necessarily compliant. It has a strength and a memory. Sometimes the maker levers the material, and sometimes the material levers the maker. Sometimes the maker bends the material in a way it cannot return from. It remembers what's happened and it can't get back to where it was. It's been kinked or something in some ways happened, but sometimes the material springs back and hurts the maker. So materials aren't neutral, they elicit a response. There is a kind of dialogue and engagement between maker and material. And if you try just to control the material, it won't work. Rather, you precisely have to respond to what the material you're working with affords, and take a risk and let go of this kind of desire, if you like, to control. And this state of mind required to do this, I'd argue, is what David Pye would call the workmanship of risk. Because you're putting your own rhythms and workmanship into relation with that of the material. And this dialogue with materials through hand skills and human technique, bodily technique, is one of the things I think that inspires makers to learn more then about the materials, about the skill, and about the history of the way this skill has been learned. There's a kind of repetitive, rhythmic use of hand skills and techniques, and an understanding of spatial relations and forces such as tension or compression and dimension, which together form the skill. And as a learner, these activities and movements may at first seem clumsy, but with practice and repetition, they become ready to hand, as Heidegger might say, instinctive, and become a kind of, almost a kind of tacit knowledge that one feels one can then do almost without thinking. And that's despite the fact that the makers are working within what Deleuze and Guattari would call a variation of variables, which you can see here in the materials. Being plant materials, each basketry stake and strand is after all different from the one before and the one that follows. They have different widths and different lengths and strengths, and any one strand in the wrong place can change the shape of the basket. Strands are also quite short, so that new ones are continuously being added in. It still isn't possible to make a basket by a machine because of this. And people who say, well, you can do one by a 3D photocopier, you don't actually make something that's held together by the same forces as a basket is held together by. And I think that this combination of the engagement with materials through the hands and the special kind of attention required to make a basket is what the philosopher John Dewey would call an experience. And what I think Dewey means by this is the kind of distributed attention involved in basket work, focused on one activity, but extending beyond the body into the material, which makes learning skills quite special. So it becomes, and you can say that was an experience, I've learned that. And you learn beyond the body into the material, and the memory of repeatedly making such baskets becomes saturated as an experience, and the memories associated with these activities become easier to recall. So an illustration of what I mean by this, I experienced myself working with elders living with dementia on the island of Uist in the Hebrides, where we found that if we brought examples of skills or tools of a craft which people had learned when young to a gathering or a care home, that these artifacts or materials could inspire people living with dementia to remember the skill and to be able to practice it again, whether we're talking about gutting a fish or mending a fishing net or twining a straw. And it also inspired people to begin to talk about the time and associated events when they'd used those skills in the past. So I'm just going to read you a piece of text that Paula, with whom we work, recorded with someone that she worked with in a care home, with a man that she'd worked with who hadn't really talked for several months and had been really quite quiet and was living with dementia. And he says, "It's 20 years since." And Paula says, "Since you last mended a net?" And he says, "Aye, since the net's a long time, good knots, strong. The nets always break, you can't help it." And then he says, because he's showing her how to do it, "It's a net mending needle. No fancy word, no. Hold it further back, no, not like that, like this, see. Watch me, aye, that's it, now over and over. I did this every day." Then talking about someone across the room, "I know him, Coy, aye, I know him well. It's been a long time. We were the best, we were good, we had to be. No room for mistakes, slow, lazy, no, very brave. A hard life, all weathers, every day, no choice. But the seals would follow my boat most days and the birds. I liked that." I think many of us will have encountered how group activities such as knitting or sewing bees also produce a very conducive environment for discussion. This activity seems to synthesize ideas rather than being analytical, and to bring things together rather than breaking them down. And we've tried this use of activity during discussion at our symposium and our research studios, and we found that these really help discussion at these kind of gatherings, and the quality of discussion categorically improves. And you're probably aware that craft skills such as basketry in particular were used in the past as a form of therapy and rehabilitation. And here you can see how in World War I in the UK and Scotland, that patients recovering from war trauma were often given mending nets to do in the Old Mill Hospital in Aberdeen. The significance of basketry practices here is in large part because the attention and the use of hand-to-eye coordination can help in the development of neuroplasticity following brain injury or stroke or even shell shock. We also worked in a stroke recovery unit in Inverness with people recovering from brain injury or stroke over several months. And this work is carrying on now, although we're no longer working with them. And we found that the manipulative skills used in basketry not only help to mobilize the body, but also help with other effects of brain injury, such as problems with insight or reflection and so on. So in a sense, the embodied learning, such as used in hand skills, really is about learning a skill through working with an integrated body and mind. And this aspect can be used in healing, recovery, and memory work. And this aspect of hand skill has also recently led us to explore other ways the learning of hand skills can be useful and important. If learning hand skills can aid discussion, conversation, coordination, memory, or recovery from injury, how can this also affect other aspects of human cognition, such as creative thinking or mathematical insight, and so on? So our latest research project, Forces in Translation, focuses on the relationship between basketry and cognition, especially in regard to mathematical learning. In this recent project, we've been exploring how the bodily knowledge in basket weaving enhances especially spatial and geometric understanding through the gestural moves we make and the bodily skills we use. One of our growing concerns is that the development in the digitization and streamlining of education parallel a view that many hand skills are not relevant for human learning or no longer relevant for human learning and cognition. And this is a view which has, if anything, intensified since the pandemic with the increase of online learning and working from home. Yet in parallel, research in education and cognition, including our own, including our own work, increasingly foregrounds the centrality of bodily skills in nurturing thought and imagination. So we consider that hand skills are an essential complement to other forms of learning, and this is what we wanted to explore in this project. And we were also concerned about human responsiveness through engagement challenges and differs from the kind of responsiveness you find in machines which may react on stimuli without understanding what follows. And they may not follow nuances of memory, ideas or rhythm, and so on. So for the past 3 years, we've been exploring areas such as spatial relationships, curvature, growth, surfaces, and mathematics and plant and material structures, and the role of forces such as tension, friction, and stretch and compression. And as I say, project's called Forces in Translation, so we are interested in forces. And we began working in person. And then with the pandemic, we had to complete part of the project online, and now we're back in person again. So we've been forced to learn the benefits and limitations of working virtually, as well as working in person together. And I think that's really given us quite a kind of wide understanding of different ways of learning by hand. So here we are working together quite recently at Kew Gardens, since we're actually allowed to work together once more. Now, as illustration of the kinds of mathematical insights working hands-on in 3 dimensions of produce, I'm going to just focus on one example from the theme of our first studio trial, which was called Turning a Plait. And this was an exploration of working up from the base to the sides in a plaited basket, and considering how this compared with what academic papers which are written about the subject had to say about what was happening. Many of these papers were written about this subject from the basis of diagrams or visualized by computer modelers whose models on screen usually imagine a process without materials or hand interaction. And it was here that basket maker Mary Crabb, who we work with, first developed her work on skew cubes, which is what you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. So skew cubes are cubes which are often made from graph paper, where the sides are folded obliquely across the vertical and horizontal lines of the squared paper to create smaller skewed boxes. So you start off with a 10 by 10 square, and then you go across from, say, 3 up to 7 down, and you make a square that's actually a smaller, has smaller sides instead, and then you assemble that into a box. And then the question is, what mathematicians are interested in is how many times from one starting point you go all the way around until you get back to that starting point again. And the idea being that if you go 7 by 3 cube, 7 by 3, then you'll get a different result than if you do, say, 8 by 2 or 9 by 1. So Mary Crabb, tried to create this through plaiting rather than through simply drawing it onto paper. So this is Mary beginning her work on her skew cube with red and black plaited work. She says, the big question I was wanting to answer was, what happens to the pattern on the top face when the cube is enclosed? Would the red and black checkerboard base be reflected on the opposite face? The pattern that had started to form on the sides had a reassuring sequence to it, alternating rectangles 7 by 3 in both planes and checkerboard. So here we have the base, and then each side either has a sort of plain area with a checkerboard either side of it, which is 3 by 7, or it has a red plain area. Some are black, some are red, and then they have this kind of triangle either side of them, which is a checkerboard. She says, but I discovered when she got to the top, and this is the puzzle, that some of the strands resolved while others conflicted. Why? Remarkably, on the top surface of the plaited cube, there was more than one possible outcome, because the interlaced strands coming to meet each other were often in opposing colours, which means this whole theory about taking a line around a cube from a starting point and getting back to it is actually a little bit contradictory, because when you get to the top, you find that there's a possibility in some cases of having a red or a black going across the top. Mary explained, I quickly came to realise that colouring individual squares on a diagram detaches from the process of weaving. The woven strands are dynamic with movement and direction. The coloured squares are static, or the graph paper squares are static and no longer relate to the strand. Their sense of being part of something greater is lost. They are just squares. So in other words, you really learn differently by practically weaving a form than by imagining it. And apart from anything else, if you kind of imagine it or draw it, you don't take into account the fact that there will actually be 2 layers if such a square is woven. Okay, so the last 3 slides that I'm going to show are going to illustrate just some of the other work that we've done during the project and a final exhibition that we've just recently finished in Wales. And what I want to say is that working in 3 dimensions isn't necessarily better than drawing or working on screen, because sometimes you can have really interesting things happening by drawing diagrams or working with models, but you enrich what you're doing if you actually communicate and share the different kinds of experience and dimensions of experience that you get. Okay, so just to show you a couple of the recent things we've done. So a lot of this work was exhibited in Wales recently in Ruthven Craft Centre, and here's an example of some work also that we've recently tried out on looping and exponential growth, and some other examples on the left of Mary's work with lines, and also kind of she's taking her whole work with cubes into yet more dimensions and is actually knitting Skew Cubes now. I'd just like to finish by saying that in focusing on one artifact, the basket, and a skill, basketry, I hope I've shown you not only how handmade artifacts such as baskets can act as fabrics of society, but also how the very activity of making artifacts such as baskets are important in the process of us developing our own cognition, while at the same time providing insights onto the wider patterns of how the world works. On the one hand, you could say that basketry is a cultural practice. It illustrates our humanity, our propensity for culture, and our need for tools and objects to extend our capacities, to help us carry things or trap things and so on. But such embodied skill practices also help us grow and learn and develop as humans, and this embodied practice or aspect is fundamentally significant in the way that we process and embed this kind of knowledge.
Thank you very much. That was great, and such a, you know, from Central Asia to Scotland within 30 minutes or a little bit more. Very impressive. Can I ask the Q&A panelists, please turn on your cameras, and yes, if you have questions, use your raise hand function, and then please, I will call on you, and and then please ask your question. Can I start off with Ivan?
Hello, thanks very much for this. I'm sorry I missed the beginning, but this is fascinating. And I just want to draw your attention to the possibility of cultural parallels here, because I think basketry can profitably be studied in a comparative manner as well as purely locally. And the questions that you raised with the construction of skewed cubes with black and red is highly reminiscent of the work of Chitimaca basket makers in southern Louisiana. And these are extremely sophisticated baskets made of river cane in a double weave. That is a basket, as it were, turned inside out upon itself with two layers. So the inside is plain and the outside is in three hues: black, red, and natural. And exactly the same puzzles that you were describing in respect of the, as it were, weaving the skewed cubes comes to play in the analysis of those baskets. And I think your stress on the importance of embodied skills in trying to understand this is absolutely spot on. So I don't really have a question, I'm afraid, for you, but I just wanted to draw attention to a parallel case.
I mean, I would love to know more about that. That is certainly something I haven't come, I mean, we have done quite a lot of work on different cultural forms, and we do have reading groups with our project where we do loads of reading around all this, but I haven't come across this, and I'd certainly love to know more about it. So you're very welcome to email me and give me the information. Give me some more information.
I can send you some materials that I've published on this. So yeah,
that would be great. Thank you.
Great. And Freya was next.
Hi, thank you so much for that. It's very fascinating and I'm thinking a lot about it. So I apologize in advance. I'm not going to be as articulate as I'd like asking a question, but I've thought a lot about pattern making as a way, as a method of processing things maybe that are things that don't lend themselves to kind of verbal processing. And I wonder, I mean, this is embedded in so much of what you were just talking about. So I know I'm not bringing up a new idea, but I wonder if you'd be willing to speak just a little bit about this relationship between words and you know, I mean, embodied knowledge, but also this kind of nonverbal, way of working through things. I mean, I was really fascinated about the transcripts from, you know, the people speaking about their past and making, and all of these, right? All of these thoughts that about the, you know, what the life was like and the birds and the seals following the boat, and all of these things are wrapped into this activity that, you know, that the words kind of diffuse or sort of disperse, right? And you're left with this product. And I just wonder if you've thought about that relation between the verbal and the nonverbal.
Yeah, I have, and I find it really interesting. I'm not sure I completely have taken everything you said in, but I do think it's really important. And you know, when you make a basket, for example, when you're teaching somebody to make a basket, you often have all these little kind of sayings that you say to people. This is just the start, right? This isn't just all the stories people tell, but just to help somebody get on with what they're doing, you'll say something like, in front of two, behind one, or no overtaking, or, you know, blah, 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 whatever. So there's all those little things. But then in some situations, such as with, for example, string figures, you have a story that's being told at the same time as a string figure is being made. And the result of the string figure is that you let go of the string figure and it disappears. And all you have left is the story, as if there's the same kind of process, not exactly the same, but very close. And yet the outcome is a story rather than an object. And so to me, I think they're completely and fundamentally bound up together. And I think that's really important, particularly for our interest in, say, mathematics and structure and pattern, because to me, it seems that there's a sort of as if baskets come from the same place as words or songs in some way. And there's someone who's written about this recently, which I find really, really interesting. But that baskets come from that same place. And I think it was Paulus Girdis who said, he talked about women from Tonga saying that that baskets come from the same place as music. So, you know, I think there's a real connection there. And whether it's narratives and stories that people tell about their lives, or whether it's repeated songs or myths, whatever, I still think there's some sort of very interesting synthesis about all this. And that is exactly, I suppose, going back to what, say, Dewey says is an experience. It's like something that's really, really condensed, all in one activity.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I was going to, just to jump in there, I was going to go even further, that Freya formulated it as a distinction between you know, words and things, but I have the problem with the use of the word imagination. It actually came up in your talk once when you spoke about the foregrounding of bodily skills for the learning and imagination, and I don't know what other word to use, but imagination is such a cognitive and representationalist. It's like you have pictures inside your mind. But now when you're saying music, I find that actually much more helpful to think with, that they come out of the same place where poetry and music can be, rather than where pictures are stored. That's sort of how the traditional thinking, in traditional Western thinking, that the brain works as a store of images.
Yeah. I mean, I have to confess, I shouldn't use the word imagination, right, because I have the same response to it that you do. Right. I struggle with it, and I'm not sure why, because some of my colleagues and people I work with really closely use it. And I sometimes say, well, I don't think I've got an imagination. Right. You know, I sort of don't think I imagine all these pictures or whatever. But then we obviously, I think one of the things I've learned, that it's really interesting to talk to people who think differently from you, to sort of figure out what we're all talking about and where the kind of overlaps are. So yeah, I agree with you. That's exactly what I find helpful, really, was the question of the music. I found so much more helpful in a way than the idea of imagination.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. Kate.
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. It's amazing, so much there. That I'm wondering about, so distributed attention, that the acquisition of new skills in partnership with materials, and what happens when this intersects with a new skill, either a sort of atavistically acquired one, a new fresh skill like the ones you're doing in your workshops. And I wonder if you can address that sort of in the layering of skill through perhaps your own experience. So where the Kyrgyz felting and the basket making are intersecting in your own bodily experience, in your distributed attention. What happens when you acquire more and more and more skills and they come together in sort of cognitive and neural pathways?
I don't know if I know the answer to that question.
But just something that, I mean, have you had an experience where, was there any time that the felting experience came into, and the patterning came into your experience with basketry?
Never come out as I expect, as far as I can see. It's quite difficult to it's quite difficult to put your finger on what's going on sometimes. I certainly find that it's easy to get confused. So that things I learned a long time ago, it's rather like a language, you know. If I learned French a long time ago, and then I learned Russian, which is what I had to do, I found that I was kind of had phases of my speaking those languages where one would come up when the other was meant to come up, or something like that. And it's a bit the same with, say, learning different basketry techniques. But I suppose it's actually really funny, the thing about felt and basketry, because the techniques are so different. And the very practice, and one of the things that's interesting is that the very practice of making pattern in felt is one where you cut it out. Whereas when you make pattern in a other kind of textile, it's part of the structure of the fabric. And you can say with felt that, for example, with the Kyrgyz felt makers I worked with, that they cut and sew it together, so it becomes the structure of the fabric. But it's a very different kind of thing, really. But then I'll go back into maths. I mean, God, you know, I thought I was good at maths when I was at school, but if you don't do it for 50 years, you really aren't very good at it after that. But I'll sometimes come across something that Ricardo will talk about, and I'll realize that doesn't relate to what I want to do in basketry. So he might talk about arcs and cutting out things from shapes, and I'll suddenly think, my God, this is just what I needed to know when I was writing that paper about felt making 5 years ago, or something like that. So that's not really quite answering your question, but it's about as close as I can get, I think.
No, thanks. That's a great answer. I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, you're next.
Thank you so much for this talk and these great answers. I have a question about I suppose the social contexts of this kind of learning that you're talking about. You know, it occurs to me that a lot of the examples you're bringing up are these sorts of communal, informal learning. But I'm wondering, do you see a change in the kind of meaning or impact of making when it becomes more structured or formalized, you know, in sort of crafts education in schools, or in some of these kind of rehabilitative contexts? You know, just what is the sort of importance of the particular social relationality or social structure that the learning happens within?
Well, it is quite important. For example, with something like basketry, if you learn from, say, John Cowan, who you saw making, he learned from somebody called Colin Manthorpe. He was making, so John learnt his skill of basketry from Colin Manthorpe, and Colin worked in a basket workshop in Great Yarmouth. And when you learn in that way, you observe. Somebody doesn't stand there and say, this is what you do. In contemporary workshops, if I go to a basket workshop, someone will say, this is how it's made. You know, you do this and then you do that, and then you do this and then you do that. And when I did field work, Kenjay, who I worked with, there was no way she was going to condense her knowledge into an explanation and tell me. She'd just go, nah, and she'd point to what she was doing, and I had to follow it. And at the time, my language wasn't that great because she couldn't speak very good Russian and I couldn't speak Kyrgyz, and it was really difficult. And we really just did have to, you know, she couldn't explain it anyway, though, because that wasn't what she did. That wasn't how she did. She didn't stand at the front. So it's a very different kind of skill, but people still will draw your attention to when you're making mistakes and show you how you're not. So I think your attention is sometimes, well, we have a more worded way of trying to learn, but I've come to the conclusion that sometimes some people, we have different learning styles. So some people really benefit from that observational way of learning, and some people actually really like explanations.
Thank you.
And Antonia.
Thank you. Yes, just following on Colin's last comment, it'll be very interesting. I have a bunch of students currently engaging in embodied craft practices as a method of research in my course. It'll be interesting to see how they're learning almost exclusively through YouTube in this remote setting is going to affect how they end up developing these skills. In any case, my question has a bit more to do with what Kate was asking, and just kind of another aspect of that. I'm interested in the idea of craft as process and craft as knowledge as it interfaces with the specificities of material and technique. And so I was wondering if you could speak more about the specifics of basketry as a particular form, or even if we could say a particular configuration of knowledge, cognition, and skill. Is there something that we might call a basket cognition as distinct from, say, a clay cognition that might offer opportunities for certain kinds of research questions, certain kinds of hand skill development? I'm wondering for your thoughts on sort of the character of these particular practices and the kinds of cognition and skill that they collect and gather.
Well, I mean, I suppose one could look at the sort of, Marcel Mauss techniques of the body, and that we always learn culture at the same time as we learn a skill. So if it's just eating with a knife and fork, or if it's eating, we learn eating with a knife and fork or with our hands, for example. So we're always learning a specific approach at the same time as we learn something, and even something as simple as sitting down, we learn to sit on a chair rather than on the floor. And when it comes to basketry, maybe there is a particular basketry culture, but my instinct is more that there are ways of thinking within basketry that are different. So, for example, in the UK and in Europe, the common technique we use in basketry is weaving, where we have a lot of stakes, they go up, and we weave in and out of them like that. Whereas in a lot of parts of the world, there are different techniques. There might be coiling, there might be plaiting, and various other ones like that. And for example, plaiting, a plaited basket, you'd think it could be woven, because it looks just as if you've gone in and out from one way, through a load of stakes the other way, but it's actually done on the diagonal, like that. And you're actually plaiting it like you do your hair. So you're just continuously doing that. For me, I don't know. I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to explore when we began this project, because I find it much harder to think in a plaited way and understand the processes and to improvise within a plaited system, or to develop pattern within a plaited system, than I do within a weaving system, which in my mind is more linear. So that's just one example, but I mean, there's many ways of thinking in basketry. There's triaxial weave, which is going in 3 directions. It's one of those ones which you can really struggle with, and so I don't know if there's a basket way of thinking as opposed to, say, a felt making way of thinking. I don't know, but I can say within basketry, I think there are certainly different ways of trying to work out problems according to the techniques you use.
Great. I'm going to briefly turn it over here to the Q&A questions we received online from the virtual audience. First of all, a comment from Heather McCune-Brune. She would like to thank you for addressing the dialogue that takes place between the artist and the work being made. This is something that I think is often ignored by non-makers, but is so very important for our understanding. Secondly, there's a question by Chloe Chapin. Could the boxes or baskets mentioned by Stephanie and Ivan with the black, red, inside, outside options be compared to woven structures with supplemental warps? I'm curious about the making relationship between basketry and textiles. And she thanks you too for this fascinating talk.
Okay, just trying to remember what the first one was about now. I can't read my own writing here. The dialogue between the maker and say the mathematician, I think that was what the broad thrust of the question was about. Is that right?
And the first one was a comment on generally that the dialogue that takes place between artist and work being made. I think it didn't ask for a reply. The second one was more specific about the black-red inside-outside options, whether they can be compared to woven structures with supplemental warps.
I don't really know the answer to that, because they weren't woven, they're plaited to start off. And so therefore, one thing that I've never achieved is to add an extra warp in plaiting. You know, I can see how you can add an extra warp in weaving, or when you're twining a basket, for example, but I can't figure that one out. It's difficult if you want to do it. You can do it with plaiting, but it's a different experience, and it's not what we were doing really. If you want to add an extra, for example, if you want to go around a corner in plaiting, you would decrease the number. You could, but I wouldn't call it a warp really, because it's not. They're both the same strength in plaiting, as opposed to warp and weft, where they're different. If you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And that throws up a whole other area for discussion, with adding and taking away, and mathematics. Yeah. So I don't know. I think I'd have to talk to the person in person and really thrash out exactly what they meant there and whether they were satisfied with that answer.
A future experiment. And then we have another one from Jennifer Ruth Hoyden. To what do you attribute the move from a physical practice and learning to an increased curiosity in the history and traditions? And second, does this differ from the occurrence of moving to doing from knowing, intuitivity? Shall I read them again, or did it sort of make sense to you?
I've just managed to get it out onto my screen.
Right, great.
So I can refresh my memory of what it was. I mean, this is one of the challenges, isn't it, really? And I think it is the fact that it is such a, for me, my answer is, if there is an answer, is that it is somehow that physical engagement makes the experience more interesting. And it is kind of often provoked by the material. So, for example, some forms of weaving basketry are, I don't know, the material just elicits this great interest, you know, and my experience when I've written about this is that there was a huge explosion of interest in willow among basket makers in the 1990s in the UK and in America, because there was a sort of convention on making with willow, and people just became passionate about it, and they started learning about it. They learned its role in aspirins. They started, you know, people would, and I was working at the time at the Botanic Gardens where they had the National Willow Collection, and people were just coming in and just getting obsessed with specific varieties, what colour their stems were, what happened if you dried them like this or like that. And it's that kind of engagement, and the fact that the material itself is not passive. I mean, there's a whole area in anthropology now called the plant turn, which you may have come across, yes, with the mushroom at the end of the world and all this kind of this discussion, and that plants actually do evoke, you know, so plant materials can evoke a response, the argument goes. And I think that there's a certain kind of truth in that they do compel an interest. But I also think it kind of there's a feedback in that, which they reflect ourselves at us, and that enjoyment of skill as well, the sheer pleasure in using our hands. Really, there's a pleasure which grows as you do that, I think, and this is just a very personal response, that inspires people to want to learn more, and to want to learn from other people, and to want to learn the history of how this has been done. And it never seems to be something, you know, if it's going to happen to people, it doesn't happen to everybody. Some people hate basketry, but if it does happen, then that those are the kinds of provocations that happen when you do it.
We have to stop soon because some of our students have lectures of half past, but because you mentioned the mushroom at the end of the world, that takes me back to a topic which I wanted to just ask one brief question. And that was when you were talking about the Kyrgyz mobile communities, the pastoralists, you went further into the topic of balance, their conception of balance, and you didn't mention the word reciprocity. I think maybe that was intentional. But when you moved on to Scottish basket makers, you mentioned there it was understanding of local ecology, and you didn't use the language of balance and reciprocity. Is that intentional, or was that just a summary? And now, because you were you know, discussing the types of plants and what they evoke further, did you get interesting insights in your field work on how this works in Scotland, this ecological understanding from makers?
Yes, well, obviously the mention I made of Kyrgyz, everything in Kyrgyzstan, which is incredibly condensed.
Right.
But no, I didn't get that, and I think there is a whole real system of balance in Kyrgyz art, which is reflected actually in the structure of their imagery. You know, in what I did get in Scotland, that the contemporary basket makers are very, very interested in the ecological aspect, if you like, but also that older makers simply have this knowledge of how to grow black oak straw or gloy, and so on. And I mean, this wasn't something that people expanded upon me so much as simply that they had to have this knowledge of the environment just to source the materials, really. So I don't know. It wasn't something that was made explicit, which is why I guess I didn't bring it up. Right. And as for the question of reciprocity, it's certainly something that one would consider evident and possibly relevant as far as the way that Kyrgyz people think of balance. But it's not something that has been articulated among people I've worked with in Scotland. And I suppose as an anthropologist, I have to go with what people say and how they talk about things. I couldn't impose a sort of thought thread onto that.
Yeah. Yes, no, I remember from your paper on the balance, that is comes out very clearly with the tradition of motifs they're using. Good. We unfortunately have to draw to a close here. I would like to thank our speaker Stephanie Bunn once more. That was really a great presentation and so many interesting insights. And I would like to thank the audience for their attention. And please visit our website for information on upcoming events this semester. And maybe a final round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks very much.